Spacefair. Hey, what the UFO? This is just me, Caleb, today. I'm going to walk you guys through the hearing of September 9th, 2025. We're going to talk about everything that happened. I'm going to give you the quick tick-tock so you can walk on out of here in less time than it would take to watch the actual hearing. So I'm going to give you a beat-by-beat, play-by-play, and I'm be pretty zippy about it. So we're going to move right through it. I might trip over my tongue a little bit. Apologies in advance. Top line, big picture impression for me, this was an improvement. People felt a little more comfortable in the room. The questions flowed more naturally. They picked some good witnesses, and they mostly got good information. We didn't break the case wide open, but we had good, solid sightings brought by very credible, serious people. George Knapp was a value add as a journalist who had the look, big picture, here's what's going on kind of view. And then they had a not very useful person who was there just to talk about whistleblowers, and we'll get to him in a minute. To paint the picture, there are some luminaries in the room. Right over Mr. Knapp's shoulder, there's the happy, proud Papa figure of Jeremy Corbell. You've also got Danny Sheehan in the room, Jim Garrison from Ubiquity, James Fox is there, a couple other figures, some cool-looking lady with a very colorful shirt. I don't know who she is. And Dave Grush is there, but he's there as a congressional aide to Rep. Burleson. So he's actually on the dais of bigwigs and not testifying or adding any information today, just working behind the scenes in an official capacity, which is nice to see. Okay, so ready for the TikTok? Here we go. Rep. Luna opens the meeting. She slams Arrow right away for their bad report. She delightfully pronounces Kirkpatrick's name Kilpatrick, and I think she does this throughout the hearing. Just a great little accidental or possibly intentional burn. She clearly doesn't like him. She says that UAP are either a defense emergency or a scientific revolution of some kind. She doesn't use the word revolution, but she means big effing deal. Then she throws it over to Jasmine Crockett, who is the ranking member of this committee, even though she's in the minority, believes she's a Democrat. Crockett doesn't really want to talk about this. She's one of two people who really, I think, whiff this hearing. She says UAP transparency is important for defense. She says she thinks these are probably adversarial tech, so at least she puts her cards on the table. And then she says whistleblowing safety is critical for healthy government, which is true, but she sort of just wants to use that to make political points, and we'll come back around to that later. Then Luna introduces the witnesses. We got 5 pretty cool people. Jeffrey Nusatelli, Air Force vet, and also former military police officer. That was, I think, his role in the Air Force primarily. He was there for a while. I think he said 17 years. Then there's Chief Wiggins, who is a Navy Chief Petty Officer. He's been in the Navy for about 24 years, almost 24 years, he says, and he's still serving, which is great because, as Burleson points out, he's the first person to be actively serving and talk about this stuff. Then Miss Titus from Nevada introduces George Knapp and lauds him for his 27 regional Emmys and his Edward R. Murrow Award and his just great work being a serious journalist in Vegas for all these years. Then Dylan Borland gets introduced, I guess also by Luna. She's Luna's introduced Nusatelli and Wiggins, then Miss Titus from Nevada introduces Knapp, then back over to Luna to introduce Dylan Borland. He's an Air Force veteran. This guy's got a sighting, which we'll talk about later, and then he's had some interactions with Arrow, and he got read into some SAP stuff, which means he's the one who's going to be struggling with the Skiff, I can't talk to you, I want to tell you more than I can stuff today, but we'll get into the details in a minute. And then finally, Mr. Spielberger is a whistleblower research guy. He works with a nonprofit that makes advice to the government about how to improve whistleblower protections. So he's there to talk about that, but he doesn't know anything about UAP. And as we'll get into, he's not a super duper useful witness, but it is kind of professional to have somebody at least who understands that subject. It's just that he doesn't know anything about the core topic. And so he's sort of an escape hatch, which I'll talk about when I get to the people who talk to him only. Okay, so Nusatelli gets an opening statement. He says he's former military police. He's a 16-year Air Force vet. Might have said 17 before. He was at Vandenberg Air Force Base, I think it's an Air Force Base, for 5 UAP events between 2003 and 2005 during a critical set of missile launches. As he describes later, these missile launches cost $5 million and 10 years to develop. He says there were 500 military police on the base to take care of this operation. It was a very big deal. So it was a real bad moment for everybody when stuff started popping up. And he describes what popped up in his opening statement. First, he says that the big red square got seen by Boeing contractors in 2003, massive glowing red square about the size of a football field. Says that Aero and FBI have the records of this. And then he moves on to a huge triangle, which is larger than a football field, that blasted off at impossible speed. Another huge triangle, which also rapidly blasted off, after which witnesses were intimidated into not reporting. And then 4 was a huge triangle that drifted off, and 5 was a craft that he saw at his house with 2 of his friends who were also military police. It started as a dot of light that they thought was a satellite, then it descended to over his house and appeared as a 30-foot diameter sphere of light, and then it blasted back up to the sky and disappeared. He and his friends have been talking about that ever since they saw it. I believe it was in the early 2000s. So he calls for 3 actions. This is Nusatelli still. He says we should fund independent research, we should reduce classification, and we should protect witnesses. And he makes an impassioned appeal to this effect. It's a good opening statement. Over to Wiggins for his opening statement. On February 15th, 2023, at 9:15 at night off the coast of SoCal on the USS Jackson, Wiggins saw a luminous tic-tac shape emerge, he thinks, from the ocean, line up with 3 others, and then blast off impossibly fast. The sensor data, he says, of this event are now public, and he makes 3 main points. We have got to do better at UAP reporting because it's a safety issue for craft. We need better data standards and chain of custody practices so we can get information about this out to people. And we need reporting without stigma so that Congress can provide safe, transparent information about this subject. He's a little less passionate, but he's very detailed, like borderline on the nerdy detailed. I couldn't keep up with some of the acronyms, and we'll get into his sightings in a little bit more detail a little bit later, but that's one really clear big event from Wiggins. Over to Knapp. He is an investigative reporter. If you know anything about UAP, you obviously already know George Knapp. He's been on this for his whole career. He says whistleblowers need protection from extra-legal bad behavior, like the stuff that's been happening to David Grush. He says, big picture, we have been told that this is all silly, but records and FOIA requests disprove that, and that is how he got into this subject. He sort of pings the Twining memo by mentioning that inside the military, people have been saying this stuff is real and not visionary or fictitious. That's a direct quote from the Twining memo. He makes this point a little bit later that there was a period before the military kind of got wise to the FOIA requests, that they did write things down about this, and we had access to that information. So there was a period of time where the military was telling people this is all nonsense, nothing to see here. Then FOIA, the Freedom of Information law, got passed, and people started requesting information from the military, and some of these documents came out where people were saying, yeah, this is real as far as we know. But then once the sort of new regime of FOIA-ready military and intelligence behavior set in, these agencies clammed up and they stopped making that information so available. Okay, so the serious people that George Knapp mentions having interviewed include Harry Reid, James Lakatsky, and Robert Bigelow, all people with insight into the inner workings of the program, quote, end quote, to research UFOs from the military U.S. perspective. But then he tells this story that probably people knew, it was new to me, about getting a whole bunch of files from Russia, which he then introduces as evidence and into the congressional record here as a part of this event, which is big because he says only 1% of these papers have been public before. So this is a nice, new document dump for UFO research for years to come. Basically, the way it happened, he describes as he met a Russian physicist in the post-Cold War but pre-Putin era when we were sort of warming up to Russia and the US and Russian scientists were talking to each other. They got Knapp over there. He talked to some scientists. They said, look, we've got a reverse engineering program. We want you to know about it, and we want you to take some of this information back and see what you can get out of your guys on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So they give him some documentation. He basically smuggles it out of the country by removing the page that says top secret and then carrying the rest. And he's now introduced that all into the congressional record. I'm not exactly clear on the year that he got this documentation, but you could probably look it up and you can get all the stuff that's written in this congressional record by researching the 9/9/25 hearing. You can also get written opening statements from all these guys, which I like doing. I like referencing the written opening statements from all the UFO hearings. I recommend them as a good like primary source, especially when you're sharing with people who don't know what any of this is. Then Luna sort of interrupts George Knapp and plays the USS Jackson Tic Tac video because she wants to get it played into the record. It's a little bit of a sort of non sequitur, but we basically get to see the footage of Chief Wiggins's report, which isn't super duper impressive, but it is like a clear tic-tac-y shape on a black and white field. And the important point is like, this is military sensor equipment that has captured this information. And Wiggins says throughout this whole hearing that they did not give him a lot of trouble about this. He also mentions that he found out about this video possibly from Tim Gallaudet, Admiral Gallaudet. He certainly says he talked to the Admiral about it. And it sounds basically like the Navy has been pretty chill about this. So points to the Navy for that. I don't know why they're so much better at this than the Air Force, but apparently they are. So over to Mr. Borland. This guy has the most tense day. He is geospatial intel official from the Air Force. He only served for a few years in the teens. He had his own sighting while he was working on some war on terror stuff. He saw a big crazy triangle, which he's going to talk about in his opening statement. But then he ended up getting read into a special access program later, and that resulted in him knowing some things about the reverse engineering project that he can't really talk about. So he is frustrated and kind of scared, and he's out of a job, and he's suffered retaliation. So he is in a tough situation, and you can kind of like feel him being on edge this whole time throughout the meeting. Like he doesn't know what might happen to him if he says the wrong thing. He's unemployed and running out of money. Like it's a stressful time for Mr. Borland. And so I'm glad that he got to testify. He says he went to Arrow. He told them about his large triangle event, which was near a NASA hangar in 2012 on a base where he was working. This object rapidly ascended and I think blasted off. We'll get into the description of it in a little bit. It may have not blasted off, but it rapidly ascended. He was in a special access program. He was exposed to reverse engineering information. He testified to the Intelligence Community Inspector General in 2023, and he kind of got blacklisted after that. So he was subject to retribution that included other agencies that he was working for, trying to find out what he told the Inspector General, including he describes being polygraphed as recently as 2024 to find out what he revealed to them, which sounds like it was pretty nerve-wracking for him. He's pretty upset. He calls for action, and Luna formally apologizes to him, which is nice. Over to Mr. Spielberger. His role is he's a senior policy council guy on the Project on Government Oversight, which is delightfully acronymed POGO. They defend and advocate for whistleblowers. Whistleblowers often face blowback. Congress generally supports whistleblower protection, although it can get a little partisan sometimes, because if a whistleblower is bringing stuff to light that the party in power doesn't like or makes them look bad, then they're not going to support whistleblowing in that moment. So Spielberger's take is whistleblowers need stronger protections. Congress should pass better legislation. Okay, simple enough. Now we start the questions. Rep. Luna goes first, although she offers it to Moskowitz because he's busy. He declines. She asks Borland first, why are you confident that what you saw wasn't human? So now Borland describes his triangle sighting. He says he saw a white light first, and he notices his phone wasn't working, and then he realized there were 3 more lights at points of a big triangle. Then he realized he's looking at a big black metallic, he described the paint as like a metallic flake paint on this big triangle with a light in the middle and lights at the points. And then he says it's covered in a gold plasma lava fluid, like around the top. And he says it shoots up to a flight level, like thousands of feet, rapidly. And then he describes experiencing the strong smell of a summer thunderstorm, kind of an interesting specific image. And then he says it moves slowly out over the ocean. So it doesn't blast off, but it does blast up. And again, he was on a base doing war on terror stuff, but geospatial intelligence, so not necessarily in the Middle East, just here, I think. I forget whether he gave us the location, but he did mention this thing coming off the ground near-ish a NASA launch pad. Somebody's going to ask him in a little bit, do you think this was involved with U.S. government stuff? And he says 100% it has to be, but he doesn't think it's our technology. Anyway, Luna asks him about Kirkpatrick, who she still pronounces Kilpatrick. And Borland says he hasn't met him, but he did testify to Arrow. Kirkpatrick wasn't there, but he said that Arrow immediately classified a bunch of information about this subject and that they inappropriately mentioned somebody who had told Borland to go testify. So you could just tell from his vibe that he really didn't like that experience, doesn't like Arrow, doesn't trust them, thinks they're generally misleading people. Over to Rep. Moskowitz. He starts his questions with a broad thank you to the military folks, says he's glad they're there, says he doesn't know what's happening, but he knows that we're being lied to. He asks Chief Wiggins what he thinks and specifically what happened to his worldview when he saw his Tic Tac. Wiggins says, this made me rethink everything, basically. Everything I was taught was wrong. He says it means he thinks there's something out there. He tells the Moskowitz that the Navy has not obstructed him and has supported him testifying. Borland says he has not been supported when Moskowitz goes over to him. Nusatelli and his friends say they still don't know what they saw. Nusatelli says he and his friends still don't know what they saw, but it seemed like it was curious, like it may have come down to them because they saw it as a light above the house and then it came all the way down. And Nusatelli reports this impression that maybe it came to check them out before it headed back up. Also, I don't remember for the record whether Nusatelli says it blasted back up or if it floated back up. You're going to have to watch his statement if you want to get the exact details. But the big picture is he and his two military police cop friends were at his house playing police cops, and they saw this light descend. It was a 30-foot radius sphere, and then it moved back up into the sky. Okay, over to Representative Mace. Mace asks Borland, did anybody else see your triangle thing? Borland says no. There would have been other security personnel around, but nobody else was awake. In general, it was a nighttime sighting. She asks Borland, do you think it was U.S. tech? And he says, I did once upon a time, but knowing what I know now, I'd have to answer that in a skiff. And this is the first invocation of the dreaded skiff. Then she presses him on that and says, like, what do you mean you're teasing us? And Borland says, I know enough to know that if you want to know the answer, you should go to Arrow. Okay, fair enough. Mace asks him, do you think it was a foreign government? And Borland says, I do not. I don't think it was a foreign government. Then Mace asks Borland, are you scared for your safety? Borland says, I'm not scared that someone from the government is going to come and kill me, but if I say the wrong thing here today or to any of you, I could be charged with espionage, and that could carry the death penalty. And he cites one person who suffered that. I think his name was John Kariakou. So he says, again, not scared of government killing, but is currently unemployed, has a few weeks left of unemployment insurance, and basically has faced massive repercussions that have stopped his career. So he's like freaking out on a deeper level, even though he's not scared about being taken down by SEAL Team 6. Luna says, this is Mace, says, what other things do you know? He says, basically, I would need a skiff to tell you more. And even then, I'm not sure that I'm legally cleared to tell you this. And I'm not sure what you're legally cleared to know. So again, he's just kind of stressed. Like the guy doesn't know where he stands here. He needs a better lawyer, it seems to me. He said his lawyer is freaked out, actually, when he was talking about reporting to the Inspector General. And then he says, basically, you should talk to DNI Tulsi Gabbard because she would know if I can tell you this and if you can know this. So maybe they will do that. They're going to say later in the hearing that they're going to try to get Borland in a skiff. And she notes, this is Mace still, that Arrow said that they would be doing disclosures of things they could and couldn't explain, and she hasn't seen them do that, so she's pretty pissed at them. In general, The task force is pissed at Arrow, which seems to me like a pretty good development. Okay, so then Mace asks, hey, Knapp, you got all this info from Russia. Could it be a psyop? And Knapp says, maybe. However, I did give it to people who said it was real, and that includes the Senate Intel Committee when I first brought it back. And major news stories here in America do sometimes run stories that seem like psyops themselves, like ridiculous attempts at debunking UFO lore. And he cites a specific example of a story about a military official who says he showed a silly photograph to somebody and it started a UFO wave. And his point is like psyops do happen, but they're like debunking psyops for some reason. And we've seen some of these recently. He also kind of pings without directly mentioning it, the Wall Street Journal article about the EMPs from the last few months, which also frankly seems like some version of a psyop or like a disinformation campaign to get people off the topic. Moving on, Rep Crockett takes the stand, and she's the first person to really truly fuck up. It's only Rep Crockett and Rep Lee who just like whiff it. They basically just take a pass on this hearing. And what it seems like happened is that Crockett and Lee said, we don't want to talk about UFOs. Let's get somebody we can talk to about something else. So they bring in Spielberger to talk about the general problem of whistleblowers. And fair enough, like whistleblowing is important and legal protections for whistleblowers are important. It's just frustrating to me that this is off topic. I also don't love that this is, they spend a lot of time in this hearing talking about how great it is that it's bipartisan, but almost everyone on the task force asking a serious question is a Republican. And the two prominent Democrats are Crockett and Lee, and they both ignore the subject completely. There is one Democrat, Jared Moskowitz, who does ask questions, which I listed above. So Rep Crockett talks about national security being used as a blanket defense. She asks Spielberger, can you give me an example of that? He does. Then she says, can you give me examples of other whistleblowers? He does. Can you tell me how important better protections for whistleblowers are? He says that. She celebrates that the committee is all working together. And then she says the lack of transparency causes conspiracy theories, which I really don't like because she's not getting at the substance of the issue. She's trying to say that if we had more information, then we wouldn't have these, she doesn't say the word crazy, but implicitly crazy conspiracy theories, because as she says at the beginning, she thinks this stuff is adversarial tech. So this is all a dodge. I don't like this. I think she's avoiding the topic. I think maybe she brought Spielberger on specifically to hide from the other witnesses so she didn't have to talk to any UFO witnesses. But she then, at the end of her 5 minutes, thanks all these witnesses for coming forward with what she calls their stories. She's very respectful to them, but she does not engage with their information. I was pissed. I'm mad at Jasmine Crockett for this. Over to Rep Burchett. Rep Burchett says this is an ongoing long haul. They're trying to run out the clock on us, dadgummit. He talks to Knapp and says, how can Congress protect whistleblowers? Knapp says, you got to unleash the dogs, track down the contractors. The program works with the contractors because they're outside of government controls like FOIA. So as Knapp points out, and this is frustrating, even SCIFs might not get us what we need because government contractors aren't accountable to Congress in the same way that the military is. Then Knapp makes the point that the reverse engineering might not be going great because we don't have access in these special programs to the best scientists in the world. And he makes the point later that Russia and China do give access to these programs to their best possible scientists. And America is not doing that. So we're like doing science with one hand behind our back here. Not great. Then Burchett asks, hey, Knapp, how'd you get those files? And Knapp explains he met a Russian physicist, took off the classified cover. And that when he went back to Russia later, the same people who talked to him the first time couldn't talk to him anymore. They were shut down. He was iced out. He's maybe screwed up by going public, but at the very least, he burned those bridges. Then he describes a 4-hour UFO event over a Russian nuclear missile base in which the missiles were all turned on. There were 4 hours of UFO appearances, and then all these missiles get turned on, freaking the people out on the base because they thought these missiles were about to launch at America and start World War III. And then they all spooled down and the UFOs went away. Pretty significant story. Then Burchett asks, hey, Knapp, who has this stuff? And Knapp just straight up says, Lockheed. And there are some other places too, and I can give you a list, but Lockheed Martin, definitely one of them. This is where it's nice to have a journalist and not a military dude, because a military dude would have said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't give you that information. It's in a secure, compromised preservation facility. And Knapp just gets to say, it's Lockheed, bro. He's also the only one who names names, and we'll get to the names when that comes up. But we're probably about halfway through. We're doing okay. We're at like 25 minutes. We can still make this a little bit faster. I'll be even more breathless, I promise. Okay, we get to Boebert next. Rep. Boebert asks Wiggins, could this be any tech you know about? Wiggins says no. She says, has any government agency debriefed you? Wiggins says no. She says, what was the reporting part like? He says he made his report to his tactical action supervisor. Nothing much happened after that. She moves to Nusatelli and asks, how about Arrow? Do they have these records? And Nusatelli says they have the ones that are public, but the Air Force destroys all public records, all police records over 3 years old. So none of the stuff from his base, other than the public records, I'm a little fuzzy on which ones are which, exist. So all the police reports of, I think, the triangles, those are gone. I think the reports at the time of the squares somehow made it through, but they don't get detailed enough there. In general, they just linger on this fact that it's annoying that the Air Force destroys police records that are older than 3 years old. Then Boebert asks Borland, have you seen any info saying UAP operate over restricted U.S. airspace? He says, no, but I didn't have domestic authority for that. She asks Borland, have you received follow-up from Arrow or ICIG? He says, yeah, Arrow told me they classified stuff and they went after the staff member who I think got me in there. And the ICIG hasn't gotten back to Borland, but did classify his report as credible, although not urgent. Again, just bummer of a day for Borland. She continues by asking Borland, do you think these investigations might be compromised? And he says possibly, but also people just don't want to give up their pensions, their kids' health care, their house, etc. So people don't want to talk about this stuff. And finally, this is one good question for Spielberger. Boebert asks him, do whistleblowers have to report to their own agencies? And Spielberger says basically yes, and this is a huge problem. Agency inspector generals are theoretically a little more independent, but the basic problem is that whistleblowers can't go to an independent third party. They have to report their whistleblowing to their own agency, although theoretically the inspectors general of these agencies at least have some degree of independence. But as we saw in Borland's case, you can still get bad blowback for going to an inspector general, even if you're legally allowed to do that, which is extremely frustrating and why we need better whistleblower protection. Over to Rep. Burleson. Burleson says, thank you all for coming. Thank you to everybody from every hearing we've ever done. He says, I'm not jumping to conclusions that this is aliens, but I am open to that, which is nice to hear. Then he says he just got his UAPDA motion blocked. He tried to introduce the UAPDA into the defense authorization bill, and he got it shut down. He doesn't even know who did it exactly, and it could have happened at a staff level, which is really annoying to him. They basically ruled it non-germane. And he said last year some weird random staff blocked them from getting a brief from Arrow, and he doesn't know who caused that either. So he's pretty pissed. And he's so pissed that he goes on to play a video where some object gets hit by a missile. And reporting later says that Burleson doesn't know the provenance of this video, and somebody basically just gave it to him. So this is a big headline coming out of the hearing, but the video, as cool as it looks, may or may not be very interesting. It's a little hard to tell. The witnesses later say they think it's interesting, but there's been some fairly convincing debunking already of this video in the last few days that makes it seem like it might not necessarily be that interesting. And if there is an agency out there that's pre-debunking things or seeding disinfo to get people off on the wrong trail and then pull back the rug from us and make us feel dumb later, that is the kind of thing that they might do, is dead drop a piece of appealing looking video to an unsuspecting House member who doesn't know where it's from, who then just plays it on the floor of Congress and says, I don't know, what do you guys think of this? This is not great. I gotta say, I think Burleson is doing a pretty good job here. He's the one who hired David Grush. That's great. People should be happy that he's pushing on this issue, but he should have been a little more careful with this video. I think maybe just randomly showing stuff to people is not a good idea as a first way to encounter that image. You want to dig a little deeper before you take it public. Okay, so he plays this video. It's basically a drone shooting a missile. It's a video of a thing that a drone shoots a missile at. A part of the thing comes off. It sort of looks like the thing keeps moving, but it could also be that the thing started falling. I think I'm not going to linger too much more on the video because it's interesting and you can go look at it, but I would just say it's not super duper conclusive. It's interesting, but it should not be the whole bang. So moving on, Burleson asks Knapp, what do you think of this video? And Knapp says, there are servers full of this stuff and people should be able to see it. Knapp mentions his pal Lakatsky, who basically, according to Knapp, did have information that like hands-on reverse engineering information. And Lakatsky, who was very, very careful about vetting what he could say with Dopser review, said to Knapp that he got access to a craft, that we did have at least one, that they got inside, and that it didn't have wings or fuel or anything like that. Pretty big deal. Lakatsky is a good trailhead. Okay, so then Rep Burleson talks to Borland, but that's not new information, by the way. That Lakatsky this is not like a new headline from this hearing. James Lakatsky, I think that's his name, has told his story to the extent he is willing to tell it. And what I just said is like basically the extent of what he's willing to tell. And you can pick him up as a trailhead and look at Knapp's reporting around him to see what you think for yourself. Rep Burleson asks Borland, are we reverse engineering stuff? Just straight up. And Borland says, I gotta have a skiff to tell you that, and I'm not even sure that I legally could. Which, strongly suggests yes. Because if he didn't know, he could just say, I don't know. And if he knew that we weren't, he could say, I know that we're not. So he must know something, and that something probably has to lean toward some version of yes, or it wouldn't require a skiff. Then Burleson does something kind of weird and reads a little list of other witnesses that Stephen Greer gave him. It's just sort of a strange name to introduce to the party because Greer has bashed a bunch of the people in this room and people who are involved in this subject. But he did submit a list of witnesses for Burleson to check out, and he reads those guys into the record. Then we go to Rep Lee, who is just full on bullshit. I'm so mad. I'm madder at Rep Lee than I'm mad at anybody else in this hearing. And she doesn't want to talk about it. And she introduces her line of questioning by saying we should avoid getting distracted by sensational stories from the core of what this hearing is about, which is whistleblower protection. And like, lady, this hearing is about UFOs. Like, sorry, 4 out of your 5 witnesses are here to talk about UFOs. The core of the hearing is UFOs. It's not your nonprofit whistleblower guy. But whatever, she asks him a bunch of questions. Can you give me examples of whistleblowers exposing waste, fraud, and abuse? Can you give me retaliation examples? And then she just rags on Trump and Elon Musk and RFK Jr. and blasts Trump for firing inspectors general, which, hey, he deserves. But again, this is just not the point of this hearing. She makes it a little more political than anybody else. And she also just completely ignores the issue. I don't know if she doesn't know what the fuck is going on or if she's just unwilling to associate herself with this dubious topic. It seems like it's a combination of those two things. So moving on to Representative Crane, he starts by saying, I used to think this was silly, but I am now a believer. He asks witnesses if they believed in UFOs before their events. 2 of them say, yeah, I basically did. Borland says, I always believed in following the truth wherever it goes. I follow the evidence. Then he asks about retaliation, whether these guys have received it. Wiggins has not gotten retaliation. Borland has big time. And Nusatelli says kind of, like there were some people who were told to shut up after one of those triangle reports. Then he asks George Knapp, this again is Representative Crane, why have they been lying to us? And Knapp says, good question. First, to keep us calm. It was a tough time when this started happening. Later, maybe to cover up crimes, because in the process of creating all this secrecy, they might have broken some laws. And then big picture and ongoing, to protect national security. Because if this is an arms race, basically with Russia and China, it is a big fucking deal. It's not a joke. This is a serious subject. We're racing to get extremely powerful technology, and that's going to have extremely significant implications for the rest of the world. So then Knapp just kind of walks off that horse by saying, I do think there's a way for them to tell us what's happening in a big picture way without interrupting that race. And as he implies in other places, we could probably even win the race faster if our scientists knew that this was real and not some silly thing to ignore and laugh about at cocktail parties. Burleson, nope. Crane says he wrote the DOD also in July about Grush's removal of clearance and medical retirement. Grush got his clearance pulled after testifying, and I guess his medical retirement is at risk. And so Crane wrote to the Department of Defense/War and is waiting to hear back. And Luna says she will follow up on that. Somebody throws Luna an extra minute and she asks Knapp, hey, how do we know your Russian stuff isn't disinfo? Knapp says, good question. I shared some with the Senate Intel Committee, and I gave all of this stuff to Bigelow and Lakatsky and Grush, and they all said it was real. Burleson hops back in and says, Wiggins, what should we do to make sure sightings like yours get shared? And Wiggins says, good question. We need standard ways to report this stuff, and we need assurances that witnesses and whistleblowers will be protected. Burleson asks Knapp, how much will the UAPDA help? And Knapp says, honestly, we don't know, bro. The defense contractors are going to be hard to break into. They're tough nuts to crack. You're going to have to come guns blazing, and they're not going to give their stuff up easily. Knapp Burleson then asks Borland, what are the key limitations of Arrow? And he says, the fundamental misdirect that they're doing, this is again per Borland, is that Arrow's saying we don't have scientific evidence of extraterrestrials, but that's a misrepresentation because we do, quote, have things, but to prove that they're extraterrestrial, we'd have to go to one of these other planets and get some of their technology and then compare it to what we have here. And we obviously can't do that. So, big picture, this is a misdirect. Then Laura Boebert pops in to ask, how would we get to those planets? By going through the Van Allen radiation belt. She mentions that because some people think it's an insurmountable obstacle to getting in between planets, I think. She doesn't give us any more context, but she basically says, hey, how do we pass through the Van Allen radiation belt? And Borland is like, that's a good question for you, I guess, but I don't know. Rep. Perry then takes the stage, and this dude's fairly serious. He says, Borman, what did you see? Did what you see involve the U.S. government? And Borman says, in my opinion, 100% yes, it did involve the U.S. government. That was my opinion then. That's my opinion now. But again, he said earlier in this testimony that he didn't think it was a U.S. craft and he didn't think it was a foreign craft. So that's kind of interesting. We don't get any deeper information there about what Borman thinks, but it's sort of a puzzle piece to noodle on. He thinks it involved the U.S. government, but he doesn't think it's U.S. government tech. So that suggests a little more depth to Borman's opinions that we never get to anywhere else in this hearing. Then he asks him, hey, was there an after-action report? And Borman says, no. Some people told me not to talk about it, like some senior officials, and I kind of wish I'd listened to them because it ruined my life when I did. Perry asks Borman, anybody else see it? And he says, no, not that I know of. There would have been security personnel out, but I didn't talk to anybody who did. And Rep. Perry says, well, that's too bad, bro. And he's like, yeah, I know. Then he asks Borman, did the command try to confirm what you saw? And Borman says, no, nobody looked into this as far as he knows. Then Perry pivots to Wiggins and Nusatelli and says, if this were government tech, would they let you see it by accident? And Nusatelli says, no, dude. Some of the projects that we were launching cost $5 billion and took 10 years to develop. And these UAP were coming right up to the launch pad. Any mistake would have caused a catastrophe. So it's very confusing that this would have happened if it were U.S. tech. That would be extremely weird. And Nusatelli says that strongly suggests that the U.S. government was not involved. And Wiggins similarly chimes in and says, in his experience of almost 24 years, all training events were intentional. Then both Nusatelli and Wiggins say no after-action reports happened in either of their cases, which especially in the Nusatelli case is weird because there was so much money and attention going into whatever those missiles were he was working on, which are probably nuclear, bro. Seems like some high-tech stuff. Okay, so Rep. Biggs takes the field and Star Wars is his way down the trench for a run at these guys by talking about secrecy and retaliation and says we should be upset about that. You're right, Mr. Biggs. Then he asks Knapp, how did you check your witness credibility? Knapp says he looks up their references. He checks their story. Biggs asks Knapp, how do you know Arrow is fucking up? And Knapp is like, how long do you have, basically? He talks about a guy named Bob Jacobs going to Arrow to give a report of his experience with a missile test that was filmed. Bob Jacobs basically, you may have heard this story, saw a missile get zapped by a UFO in a filmed test, which apparently disabled the UFO. He reported this to his supervisors. His supervisors in the room give this film to two guys in suits who clip out the part of the film that has the UFO. Then they tell Bob Jacobs not to talk about it. So Jacobs goes to Arrow and tells this story, and Arrow says, well, we went and found the footage and there's no UFO. And he's like, yeah, I told you that they took that part out. So he was extremely disappointed with his Arrow experience. Knapp also mentions that Robert Salas was blown off. He's the guy who worked at a nuclear ICBM base that got disabled by a UFO and then re-abled. And that was the subject of this strange sort of debunky / disinfo piece in the Wall Street Journal recently that suggested an electromagnetic pulse weapon might have been involved, which George Knapp says is ridiculous, and other people have made that claim. It doesn't come up much in the rest of this hearing, so you can follow that thread another time. One really great quote that I wrote down in its entirety is that George Knapp just comes hard for Arrow in the aggressive, attacky way by saying, quote, it almost looks like Arrow operated as a counterintelligence operation to get people to come in, tell their stories, and then discredit all of them. I can't imagine any whistleblower or witness will ever go to Arrow again because of what happened under the first director, who's now long gone, but still seems to act as the spokesperson for that organization. Boom. I mean, it's just perfect. It's like an eviscerating encapsulation of the horror show of Arrow. George Knapp was there to tell Congress. That's great, because they need to hear that. And Rep. Biggs, to his credit, turns to Luna and says, okay, at some point, Madam Chair, we're going to have to dig deeper into Arrow, because this is obviously bullshit. And Luna, to a smattering of applause, says, oh, I'd be happy to send a subpoena to Mr. Kilpatrick. Just going to keep mispronouncing that name. There's support in the room for that. So we'll follow up on the subpoena idea a little bit later. Nusatelli, Biggs asks, these records? And Nusatelli says, yeah, the ones that are available are not classified. You can just go find them. Then he asks Nusatelli, were there disruptions on the base in 03 to 05, like electrical disruption or physical disruption? And Nusatelli says, no, there would be no base record reports of that stuff. He asks Wiggins, this is big still, does Congress have the full resolution unedited video of your event? Wiggins says, yes, as far as I know. Then he asks him, were you or your crew ever told not to discuss or document this event? And Wiggins says no. He asks Borland, can you talk about manipulating security clearances? What did you mean there about Arrow? And Borland says, skiff, gotta have a skiff. Is it Borland or Borman? Man, I've been saying this name both ways this whole time, huh? Borland, gonna be Borland. He's not boring in person, I promise. So sorry about that. So Biggs says to Luna, hey, let's try to get this skiff. Please, can we do that? And Luna says, yes, we'll work on that. Then he asks Borland again, can you give us specifics that led you to believe that Arrow was misrepresenting the truth? And Borland says, look, I know what I saw. I know what I know. I know they're manipulating the message. Okay, over to Rep. Begich. He comes at Borland and says, what authority would allow anyone to withhold information from Congress? Borland says, I don't know, but you should ask Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Begich asks Knapp or anyone, what's your view of the budget of the program researching UFOs? That's kind of a fun question, but Knapp says, I have no clue and I don't know anyone who's even seen this budget. Then he asks Knapp or anyone, and this is Rep. Begich still, are any of you willing to name specific gatekeepers within the UAP SAP Federation? And this is kind of an interesting question. Good question, Rep. Begich. George Knapp says two names. He says Dr. James Ryder at Lockheed and Glenn Gaffney at the CIA. But then he follows up and says, by the way, though, these people at Lockheed are mostly just doing their job as they were instructed, mostly by the CIA. So you can't be too mad at them. It's not really their fault. But he did give us two names. That's good trailhead stuff. Dr. James Ryder at Lockheed and Glenn Gaffney at the CIA. Those are specific Points of follow-up. One hopes that the task force will investigate further. Then Begich asks anybody, hey, is there a classification guide to UAP? And Nusatelli says, I remember in the 2023 hearing that they were listed as secret or above. All UAP stuff is secret or above, but that's got to be most things in the US government. Not very interesting. Begich asks Knapp, what's the long view of the impact? Knapp says, look, the public senses that this stuff is real, but the guys behind the scene, they're never going to tell us any more than they absolutely have to, because these secret keepers have an attitude that the public doesn't deserve to know, and they maybe couldn't handle it, but the secret keepers can handle it. So again, this is Knapp providing that big picture sort of structural stuff. That made me really happy that he was in the room. Then Begich asks, hey, anybody, can you tell me like the org chart of this secret UFO program? And Borland says, I could tell you in a skiff if I'm legally allowed to and you're legally allowed to receive it, which is still, it's just such a bummer that that guy doesn't know. But it's an interesting point about the nature of the situation, that people don't even know where they stand. They don't know how much it's legal for them to say, how much it's legal for other people to hear. They need lawyers. They need official, like, power players in the structure of the government, like DNI Gabbard, to tell them, yeah, you can say this stuff. And that kind of murkiness is an important, like, contextual quality of this field, because it also implies that a lot of people who know stuff aren't saying anything because they don't know whether they're allowed to say anything at all. And as you can see from just looking at 2 seconds of Borland's face or hearing me describe him, he's freaking out. So probably other people who know stuff are freaking out too and staying quiet. But Knapp does provide the one useful piece of information here, which is to say the org chart is in the executive branch. And he specifically mentions the National Security Council. He says that's where you would want to look, because the Department of Defense /War doesn't have this stuff. And if you were to subpoena them or ask them for information or send FOIA requests, they could reasonably tell you, we just don't have this stuff, because they don't. They're not in control of it. It's either the CIA and the Lockheed crew, or it's the National Security Council and other people in the executive branch. So George Knapp, like, bring in some details here. Appreciate that. Appreciate the 2 names and the narrowing down toward the National Security Council within the executive branch. Begich says, basically, anybody got anything else? And Knapp says, yeah, I appreciate your commitment. This is going to take time. Good point. So in a little cross chit chat, Burleson asks Luna, hey, point of order, does this subcommittee have subpoena power? And Luna says, point of order back, it's a task force, bro, and our task force actually needs the full committee to subpoena people. So no, is the answer to that question. But theoretically, the broader committee that this task force reports to could issue a subpoena. And then Luna mentions to Borland, hey, we're looking into getting you and a few others immunity so that you can avoid getting espionage charges if you tell us what you know in a skiff. Then Luna asks Knapp, because she's on a roll again, what was public of your Russian docs before? Knapp says only 1%. Luna says, I got through about half of these last night. I don't speak Russian, contrary to what some might allege, which is kind of a funny joke about how people have said that Luna might be a Russian ally or even an asset of some kind. She was pretty good in this hearing, I got to say. I'm very impressed with her, but like more than I have been previously. And she calls out a specific name of this Russian program, which I think was Thread 3. It might have been Threat 3. It was a little hard to make out in the talk. And she asked if there were other orgs, and Knapp says, yes, there was a larger structure of research around this reverse engineering program, and maybe it headed off in other directions that he didn't have access to. And again, we're talking about the Russian reverse engineering program there. Then Luna asks the whole panel, you guys know anything that could do what we just saw in this video where the thing gets hit by a missile? And 3 of them say no. Borland says, yes, I do, but I could tell you in a skiff. And then she asks them all, does this video scare you? Nusatelli says yes. Wiggins says yes. Knapp says he's happy it's out. And Borland says yes, but, and implies he's going to say something else about a skiff. So she says, okay, that's enough. And we move on from that. Then we go over to Rep. Crane again. This is now on a second pass of questions. We've added a final sort of emergency lightning round. And Crane mentions he actually served in the Navy. So he has some specific questions for Wiggins. He says, were you on a bridge? And did others check out what you saw? And Wiggins says, yes, at least 5 people saw what I saw. And he gives the technical roles of these people who were also on the bridge with him. And then he gives a little more information about his sighting. First, Crane asks, did this spread like wildfire over the boat? And Wiggins says, no, not really. It was mostly just the bridge crew that knew about it. Was it hard getting approval for the video? Wiggins says, I didn't get approval for this video. I found out about it and talked to Tim Gallaudet about it. And the Admiral may have provided this video. I'm a little bit fuzzy on what happened there, but Wiggins says he didn't provide the video. Somebody did. Anyway, it was a good video, obviously. It's probably ultimately going to be more useful than the missile one. We'll see, because Wiggins is like a very serious dude. And so he provides a few more details here about his sighting. Crane asks, how long was the event? And Wiggins says 5 to 7 minutes. And he describes that it moved slowly at first, going up the first 1,000 to 3,000 feet. And then it moved to about like, he would say he's like 1 to 2 Mach. I guess that would maybe be slow. Anyway, no, that's going faster. So it moves slowly up to 1,000 to 3,000 feet, and then it changes to like 1 or 2 Mach. And then when it joins up with the other 3, they all blast off like insanely fast. And he also gives us a tick-tock of what happened, which is that he saw this thing on the radar, and then he went outside and saw visually with his eyes this object about 7 or 8 nautical miles away. And then he went back inside and saw on the Sapphire, which is presumably some kind of sensor device, the other 3 objects, saw this 4th object meet up with them, and then saw them disappear, he says, nearly instantaneously. So he also clarifies that, and this is under Burleson's questioning now, Burleson says, was this object glowing underwater? And Wiggins says that his personal thought is that it came from under the water, but he doesn't actually have visual evidence of that. He wasn't quite sure. It was like a glow on the horizon, so it could have been like moving across the horizon, but his personal feeling is that it came up from under the water. Then Burleson asks Knapp, Russian and U.S. agreements, were there some about UAP? And Knapp says yes. He knows that we had exchanges to coordinate reporting around UAP, and that we had events like these here around our own nuclear facilities where UAP turned off some missiles and turned them back on. And he mentions here that the EMP story is preposterous. Basically, there's too much reporting. I would recommend people read UFOs and Nukes if you want details about this. It's a lot. It's not like 1 or 2. It's like dozens of events at nuclear installations over the history of our nuclear facilities in the United States. Representative Ogles pops up out of nowhere, and now we're almost done here, coming in for a landing. Ogles says, look, it's clear that we're looking at advanced tech. The question is it ours, theirs, or otherworldly? Can you point us to one piece of evidence, anybody, that you find especially convincing? And Nusatelli says, look, you got to start with the hearings, like this hearing, the Grush-Fravor hearing. This is the good shit. And Wiggins says, like, honestly, yeah, it's not one piece of evidence. It's the totality. Like, you have to look at the big picture. This all can't be fake. It can't all be fake. Some of it over the course of this 80 years of reporting has got to be real, basically. And Ogles says, yeah, I agree. Totality is important. Then he asks Knapp, and Knapp says, what hooked me, as he says at the beginning, is the paper trail where the military is telling the public nothing to see here. And then behind the scenes, they're saying, actually, we think this is real. And he also names the Russian gentleman he spoke to, Colonel Sokolov, who describes, this is a fun little detail that Knapp hadn't shared before. Colonel Sokolov said they sent 40 Russian planes out to intercept UFOs with the orders to fire. 3 of these planes did fire on UFOs. Those planes all stalled out, and 2 of the pilots of those planes died. So the Russians updated their standing order to new plan, don't fire on the UFOs. And as Knapp says here in the conclusion of that little area, no country wants to admit that there's stuff in their skies that they can't do anything about. That's like inherently anathema to military reporting. So they're not going to tell us unless they absolutely have to. And Borland, for his one piece of evidence, says, like, look, Bob Lazar is actually pretty compelling. He did film these things in the desert. Whatever else you want to say about the guy and some other stuff is pretty weird. And it does kind of track that Borland, who's like the wildest eyed, loosest thread, tightest wound piano chord here, would mention Bob Lazar, although Knapp mentions him earlier too, and give him his due as somebody that at least put Knapp on the map. But Knapp doesn't lean very heavily on his reporting. Burchett comes back in the game and says, hey, is Arrow lying to us? And Borland says that same thing about the evidence being weird, about the extraterrestrial thing. And then Knapp says, building on that, what would that evidence even look like? Like a piece of kryptonite? Like, how would we prove decisively that these things were extraterrestrial, even if we could prove that they're non-human? And then Knapp says the big picture is we don't really know what these things are. Nobody really knows. Like, they're not human, but they could be from anywhere. They could be from, like, you know, parallel realities or something. He doesn't say that, but his point is we don't know that they're extraterrestrial, but that's like kind of beside the point. The bigger picture is if they're non-human and they're technological, we should know about that. Burchett throws out a little aside that the billionaire oil buddies might not want this tech getting out because they make a lot of money from conventional energy tech. That's a reasonable theory. Nobody really takes him up on that and talks about it. But Knapp makes this point here that Russia and China don't have the taboo that America has, that they're telling their best scientists about it. And we should be doing that too, instead of telling them that it's nonsense, because the stigma is real and it's very powerful in the scientific community. And that's a really important point. Burleson, coming in for a landing, asks Nusatelli, hey, does the missile story remind you of anything that you've seen? And Nusatelli says, yeah, there's a story about New England bases where an object or objects came in toward the base, jets got scrambled, and then the objects left. And then Nusatelli piles on from his own base events that 30 to 100 people he knows closely were on duty for these events, investigating them in real time, and that 500 Air Force police officers were guarding this launch, as I mentioned at the beginning. So this was like, you know, serious stuff, and it would have been a very big deal if these objects had interfered with that launch. Luna asks again about the size, and Nusatelli says the two square objects were at least football field size. The second encounter was much larger, like flying buildings. He doesn't say the second encounter of what, like he doesn't clarify whether that's the triangle or one of the squares, but I think it's probably one of the triangles. But he says like flying buildings, so very big. And then the one above his house, he says, was again just 30 feet in diameter. And Luna asks about a police blotter of these events. And Nusatelli says, yes, there was a police blotter about one of the large scale events at his base. And that is a matter of public record that he has highlighted before. So Nusatelli, pretty good trailhead for your future investigation. Burleson, now we start the closing statements, brings this in and says, look, we're frustrated. We know you're frustrated. There are people in the audience who've been researching this stuff for their whole career. We can understand why you're pissed. We should pass Burchett's Whistleblower Act, and we should pass the UAP Disclosure Act. Luna says, thank you. She yields to Crockett for closing. Crockett says, I'll pass. Laughs, boos, down thumb emojis. And then Crockett says, no, but seriously, thank you all so much for your courage. And thank you for this bipartisan hearing. And I don't give a fuck about this subject. Just boo across the board, Jasmine Crockett. So fucking pissed at you. Giant whiff. Can you tell what I really think? Luna brings it in for a close and says, we know these are not isolated incidents. There's a lot more reporting out there. And Spielberger, we would like you and your org to endorse Burchett's Whistleblower Act. And hey, Democrats on this committee that are just like sucking your toes this whole time, like we'd also like you to endorse Tim Burchett's Whistleblower Act because, you know, you're so pissed about Donald Trump, et cetera. Like, let's protect the whistleblowers. And they, you know, she's not confrontational. I'm reading that in, but this is sort of a savvy move by Luna to say like, hey, maybe we can leverage some of this bipartisan comity we've got going here. We want this Whistleblower Act. Maybe you do too. I got to say, like, armchair, I think there's probably no chance in hell they pass that thing, but I really appreciate that they have an action step. And they think they probably should pass that Whistleblower Act. And I would love it if they could pass the UAP disclosure amendment. And you should call your rep about that if you live in America. I keep calling mine. He has yet to get back to me, but one of these days he will. Tim Burchett interrupts to say thank you to the leadership for this bipartisan hearing. And Jasmine Crockett rolls her eyes at him, I think. And that's just about it. Luna reads them out and mentions that everybody has 5 days to ask written questions of the witnesses, and the witnesses will be able to answer those questions. So this was really fun. You should check out the introductory statements of all these witnesses. You can check out any of the written record by looking this stuff up. I'll try to put a link in the place. But right now I'm going to bring this in because it's already almost an hour and we can get out just under an hour. That's less than half the time you would have spent if you watched the actual hearing. Thank you for playing. Keep watching this, guys. And that's the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening or watching. If you like WTUFO and you want it to keep existing, support us at patreon.com/WTUFO or on YouTube or on Buzzsprout for as little as you want per month. Patreon or YouTube or Buzzsprout, this show is brought to you by you. So thank you very much for your support. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you have a lovely day.